What's up, legends? Welcome back to my Unmatched Strategy Guide series. Today we are taking a look at Robin Hood, and for some reason the mini that came in my set was a man and not a fox, but hopefully I'm the only one with that issue. Statistically, Robin Hood is a ranged fighter with 13 hit points. His sidekicks, the Outlaws, he has 4 of them, and they are all melee fighters who of course have 1 health. Together they have a movement value of 2. I always say that move value 2 heroes are a lot slower than move value 3 heroes, but this isn't really an issue for Robin Hood because of his ability, which lets him be pretty mobile. 13 hero HP is the current minimum, tied with Dracula and Alice, and while he doesn't have defensive support in his deck, his ability will actually prevent him from taking hits, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. He's the only multi-sidekicked hero with 4 sidekicks. All the other multi-sidekick heroes have 3 sidekicks, so you have an extra little dude to take a hit for you. 17 hit points for the total health pool is quite below average, and it's really only above solo heroes and other ranged fighters with low health like Muldoon, so you really don't have that much health. Your hero is ranged, which means you should use your melee sidekicks to block your enemies from attacking your hero. Being ranged helps because you have low hit points, so you will be staying further away from your opponents, so you will likely be taking less hits. In addition to your ability, you'll be taking less hits, so being ranged really complements your deficiency in health. In terms of deck composition, you have 11 unique cards, which means your draws will be more consistent from game to game compared to heroes with 15 or 16 unique cards. In addition to this, you have a ton of card draw in your deck, which means every game you will likely be able to churn through most of your deck and see the relative same pool of cards each game. You also have 13 cards that are strictly attacks. This is second only to the Raptors, who have 16 only attacks, which means you are a very aggressive fighter, and considering that you don't have a lot of health, you probably want the game to go shorter rather than longer. Robin Hood's ability says after you attack, you may move your attacking fighter up to 2 spaces. This adds a guaranteed movement effect onto all of your attacks for each of your fighters, which is especially great for your Outlaws considering they are melee fighters, so they'll have to be next to your opponent, but they'll never end next to your opponent because they can use the ability after the combat. This means that Robin Hood and all 4 of his sidekicks will have permanent kiting with advantage, which is very helpful. I tend to overvalue movement effects, but this is just a super powerful one because it means your opponent will always be moving then attacking and usually ending their turn next to you or in the same zone as you. So it's really easy to get a lot of free hits in on them that in other matchups you might not get to see as often. This helps Robin Hood especially avoid damage rather than minimizing it with block cards, because you'll never end your turn next to an enemy fighter. Well, you shouldn't. Hopefully you don't. So your opponent will never be able to attack you twice in a turn unless they have action chaining or something like that, because they'll always have to spend the first action on their turn maneuvering to get even close to you. This is not necessarily guaranteed if you're playing against a ranged fighter, because obviously if they're in the same zone as you, they won't have to maneuver in order to attack you. But there are only like 6 other teams in the game that have a ranged fighter on them. So in a large majority of your matchups, you will be facing melee-only fighters and have a large advantage over them. This rewards you and also enables you to be able to position a little bit more carefully than other heroes do. And if you are very good about it and precise in where you move your fighters and place them out of harm's way, you will be rewarded in the sense that you won't lose as much health. This is very similar to Bruce Lee's ability, which is just at the end of your turn, you get to move Bruce Lee 1 space. So it's more movement than Bruce Lee, but it's also restricted to only after attacks. So I'd say they're pretty similar in power level. This also can't be canceled by feints. So if your opponent feints your attack, you still get to move after the combat, which is very nice. Overall, I really like this ability. It is very good on Robin Hood, especially for his low health. Let's now take a look at Robin Hood's cards. The first one is a Hunter's Eye, a Robin Hood only 5 value attack with a boost value of 4 and 3 copies. It has no effect. So 5 value attacks with no text are also seen in Angel, Buffy, Sherlock, and the Raptors decks, and are just pretty good attacks. There aren't any 5 value block cards in the game, save for the one in Willow's deck. So against most enemies, this will be a guaranteed 1 to 2 damage, if not more. It's really good if they play a feint against this because it's just 3 damage. So there's not really much to say about this. It's like larger than life and Excalibur from Bigfoot and King Arthur's decks, except obviously it's only 5 instead of 6, so it's not as insane, but it's just a really great attack. It's guaranteed damage. It's just a pretty good card. I would avoid hanging on to this against decks with ambushes in them, which is a card that Robin Hood actually has in his deck, so we'll see that later, because that will use the large boost value of this card against you. Overall, it's a 5 value attack. It's just pretty good. There's not much I can say about this. You have 3 copies of it, so you'll be slinging this around like nobody's business against your opponent. The next card is Piercing Shot, a Robin Hood only 2 value attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, draw 2 cards. Now, in other videos, I've talked about how 2 value versatile or defense cards with after combat draw 2 on them, like Little Dragon from Bruce Lee, Looking Glass from Alice's deck, and the Wolf Skin from Little Red's deck, they're all pretty good cards because drawing 2 cards is a pretty powerful effect. However, all those cards are purple or blue, whereas this card is red, and I really prefer this effect on defensive cards because it's only a value 2, so you usually won't deal any damage from this attack, and on defense, your opponent is more likely to play a feint, so you might not get the card draw every single time from this card, like you will more often than not from the other cards I mentioned. And you have a lot of card draw in your deck, so if this gets feinted, it's not a super big deal, but it just means as an attack, it's kind of weak compared to something like Hunter's Eye, which is guaranteed to do you damage. This is basically a regroup, kind of, because it's 1 value higher than regroup, but going from 1 to 2 isn't that much of a jump, especially for an attack. You really want your attacks to be like 4, ideally. And after combat, draw 2 cards. It's like you won on regroup. So yeah, it's better than regroup for sure. But for me, it's just a weak attack that's really only 1 rung on the ladder above regroup in terms of attack tiers. The next card is Disarming Shot, a Robin Hood only 4 value attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, draw a number of cards equal to the amount of damage dealt to the opposing fighter. Now this is a card draw attack I can get behind. Obviously, this will be different levels of good based on how much damage you actually deal with the attack. If you deal 1 damage to your opponent, it's comparable to a card like Exploit, which is just a 4 value versatile that says after combat, draw a card. That's a pretty good card. If you draw 2 cards with this, it's comparable to cards like Aid of Morgana, Fatal Struggle, and Daring Strike, except those last 2 have drawbacks if you don't win the combat, whereas this card doesn't have any drawbacks if you don't win the combat. And those cards are all excellent if you win, the caveat for those last 2. And if you draw 3 or 4 cards from this attack, your opponent made a mistake for 1, but that's just a ludicrous effect. A 4 value attack that says after combat, draw 4 cards would be one of the best cards in the game. And if you end up getting that effect from this card after an attack, you just feel really good unless your hand was already full before combat. Now, most of the time when you play this attack, you'll usually only draw 1 card, maybe 2 cards, depending on the block card that your opponent played, of course. But that's just a really high baseline for this card to have. If every time you play it, you can compare it to Exploit, that's pretty good. There will be some times where your opponent plays like a skirmish or something to block this and you don't draw any cards, but you made them waste a good high value block card when they could have used that on something like Hunter's Eye to actually block more damage. So even though you might not get a ton of cards from this card every single time, I still value it as a pretty powerful yet somewhat unreliable attack and source of card draw. Interesting little fun fact about this card. One of the designers on Board Game Geek confirmed that you draw 4 cards if you use this card against a 1 health sidekick and it's unblocked and you kill them. So it's not based on the amount of health your opponent has left. It's based on the amount of damage, including overkill damage, that you may do to your opponent. And I'll link to that thread in the description down below. The next card is Steal from the Rich, a Robin Hood only scheme with a boost value of 3 and 3 copies. It says, draw 1 card, then choose an opponent. They may choose to discard 1 card. If they do not, draw 1 more card. So there's one of 2 scenarios that happen when you play this card. Either you draw a card and your opponent discards a card, or you draw 2 cards. Now, non-random discard effects, as seen in Medusa's deck, for example, are annoying but not actually super powerful, because most of the time your opponent will have a bad card in their hand, like Regroup, or a card that can only be used by a sidekick that's been defeated already, and they'll just dump that out of their hand and they don't really lose anything of value in that situation. Non-random discard effects are powerful when your opponent is only holding good cards, but again, I'd say there are enough bad cards in every deck that this situation usually won't come up. However, the non-random discard effect on this card is optional. So if your opponent is only holding good cards, they just will choose not to discard anything. So either you're drawing a card and your opponent is discarding a bad card, or you're drawing 2 cards from this scheme. Now, just drawing 1 card is a pretty weak effect because you're using an action to basically replace the Steal from the Rich card. Yeah, even though your opponent is discarding a bad card, you're not really gaining anything from that because they probably weren't going to play that bad card anyway if they have good cards in their hand. So you're spending an action to replace this card with another random card from your deck, and your opponent is losing a bad card. I really don't see the value in that. It would almost be better if you just didn't have this card in your deck, so that instead of on a previous turn maneuvering to draw this card, you could have just drawn the card that you were going to draw from this card and just skipped the whole step of playing the scheme as an action on your turn. The other possibility that happens with this card is you draw 2 cards. And this is a pretty common effect seen on other schemes in the game, but most of the time those schemes have an additional effect paired with the draw 2 cards. For example, Drink Me from Alice's deck, and it might be Eat Me. I can't tell the difference between them based off the top of my head. Lets you draw 2 cards and then change size. The Golden Drinking Horn from Beowulf's deck lets you draw 2 cards, but then also maybe recover health or move. And there's a bunch of other schemes like this in the game. So just playing Steal from the Rich to draw 2 cards is weak compared to other people's decks. And you have a ton of card draw in this deck, which I've said maybe 7 times already. So you don't have to rely on this card to draw cards, thank God. But it's just kind of mediocre regardless of what your opponent chooses. If in the best case scenario for this card, you're playing it when your hand size is pretty low, but if your opponent really wants, they can just discard a card to not have you increase your hand size. And it's just it's bad regardless of the situation that you use this in. I think there's some value in the boost value because being able to move all 5 of your fighters 5 spaces on a single turn is pretty powerful. And you have 3 copies of this, so you don't really have to feel bad about using it to boost a maneuver. So I think this is one of the weakest card draw tools in this deck, but you do not have to rely on it. And let's talk about the Outlaws now. You have 4 of them. They all have 1 health, and they should be used as a defensive barrier to annoy the heck out of your opponent. Robin Hood is a ranged fighter, so you can usually just sit in the middle of a zone, surround yourself by outlaws, and then attack anyone that tries to break through the barrier. You should be okay with occasionally just not blocking an enemy attack on an outlaw because you want to save your good defense cards to actually block with Robin Hood, because Robin Hood does not have a ton of health, and if your outlaws don't take hits, Robin Hood is going to take hits, and then he's going to die fairly quickly. So the one unique outlaw card is called Highway Robbery. It is a 2-value attack with a boost value of 2, and you have 4 copies of it. It says, immediately cancel all effects on your opponent's card and ignore its defense value. So this is actually a very insane card. It's like Feint combined with what Big Eyes you have from Little Red's deck or Impossible to See from the Invisible Man's deck, because it cancels both effects and values, which basically means if your opponent plays a defense card, this card just nullifies it completely and deals 2 free damage to your opponent. Now, obviously, if your opponent plays a Feint, defensive immediatelys will trigger before attack immediatelys, which means Feint actually counters this card, and other immediately effects on your opponent's card will trigger before this card does. So there's a few niche cards that this card isn't good against, but there's only a handful of them, and in a large majority of your matchups, this card will work every time. The existence of this card means that Robin Hood's attacks are less likely to be feinted because your opponent will save their feints for when an outlaw is attacking them and could potentially play Highway Robbery. And this is really good because Robin Hood really wants cards like Piercing Shot and Disarming Shot to get their effects, so it's good that those probably won't be feinted as much. The reason why your opponent will be saving their feints for Outlaws is because they just can't use any other block card against this card because it won't block any damage and they won't get the effect off. This card completely erases anything your opponent plays, which makes it feels overpowered to have this played against you, but it's only 2 damage. However, I say it's only 2 damage, but you have 4 copies of this, which means it can very easily add up in the long run. If you hit this every time against a hero, that's 8 damage, which is over half of the average hero health total. And if you land Hunter's Eye on them 2 to 3 times, that's another like 3 to 6 damage, and you just have to land a few more attacks, and then they're dead. This is a very good card. It makes baiting cards like regroups very easy because sometimes your opponent just won't block an outlaw because they think there's just no point. If it's not a feint, my card just won't matter. So you could sneak in regroups for drawing 2 cards and winning the combat, as well as sneaking in other cards that you have like ambushes or the value 3 versatiles that we'll talk about in a little bit, which would both be very good choices to play if you think your opponent just isn't going to block your outlaw attack. This is also very good against heroes with effect-driven defense cards because if they try to block you with one of them, the effect just won't go through. And those heroes are Alice, Little Red, Invisible Man, and Jekyll and Hyde. And there's probably a few more that have a lot of effects on their defense cards, but those are the 4 that I think most rely on their defense cards for effects. This is an extremely nasty attack, and I think this is better than Hunter's Eye. I think it takes the top spot for best attack in Robin Hood's deck, and it's kind of funny that his sidekicks are the one using it. The next card is Ambush, in any 2-value attack with a boost value of 3 and 2 copies. It says, during combat, your opponent discards 1 random card. Add its boost value to this card's value. This card is also found in Dracula and the Raptors decks, and it's also in Little Red's deck too, but it's not called Ambush in that. It's like Stones in the Belly or Once Upon a Time, I think. I don't really remember off the top of my head. Random discard effects, unlike Steal from the Rich, which is a non-random discard effect, are very powerful because a lot of times your opponent has a couple pretty good cards in their hand that they don't want to lose, and when it's random, there's always a chance they could lose them. Bye-bye, Excalibur. So just the effect of them discarding a random card is pretty powerful. The added benefit of it is that you add its boost value to this card's value, which will usually make this card a value 4 attack, but there are some decks that have large boost values on their cards, and it could potentially get higher, although you could also just discard something with a boost value of 1, and that doesn't feel very good, but on average, you'll probably get an additional 2 damage on this card. If you use this while attacking as Robin Hood, it's probably less likely to be feinted because your opponent will probably save their feints for your outlaws unless they just don't care about getting hit for 2 damage a couple times. But if you use this as an outlaw, it's probably more likely to be unblocked. So I don't think there's actually a best answer for who you should attack with when using this card. If you use it as an outlaw, it might get fainted, but at the same time, you might also just get in a free 4 to 5 damage, which could potentially swing the entire game in your favor. But as Robin Hood, there's probably a more likely chance that you'll actually get the discard effect off. So I'm not really sure which way to go on this card, but I think either fighter you attack with, it's just a very solid card. The next card is Defenders of Sherwood. It is an any 3-value block only card with a boost value of 2 and 2 copies. It says, after combat, draw 1 card. Return a defeated outlaw, if any, to any space in Robin Hood's zone. As I've said before, you need the outlaws to block hits and maybe sacrifice themselves in order to keep Robin Hood alive long enough to kill your opponent. So you should really only use this if you satisfy the if any part of this card. You really shouldn't use this to block if you're not going to return a defeated outlaw unless you have to. But if you're in that scenario where you have to use this card to block and you don't have any defeated outlaws, you're in trouble and your opponent is doing a very good job. This can be used by both Robin Hood and Outlaws, so it's a pretty flexible card. And value 3 draw ones, especially defensive ones, are pretty good. And the fact that it also revives a defeated outlaw in addition to drawing a card makes it even better. This is a really good card to block with as Outlaws, but we'll get to that point when I talk about the next 2 cards. Even though this is only a value 3 block card, it's still borderline great. It effectively increases the number of sidekicks you can have in a game from 4 to 6, and thus will give you more meat shields to take attacks from your opponent so that Robin Hood doesn't have to. The next 2 cards are pretty similar, so I'm going to talk about them both at the same time. We have Snark and Wily fighting. They are both any versatile 3 values with a boost value of 1 and 3 copies. Snark says, after combat, if your fighter is adjacent to the opposing fighter, draw 1 card. And Wily fighting says, after combat, deal 1 damage to each opposing fighter adjacent to your fighter. Both of these cards are versatile, but are better suited for defense for a couple of reasons. The first is something I mentioned when I was talking about deck composition, and that's the fact that Robin's deck has a lot of designated reds in it, and not a lot of defense cards. That means these 6 cards kind of need to be used on defense so that you don't run out of things to block with. If you play them on offense, you might run out of purple and blues in your hand to even play if your opponent attacks you. With that being said, however, there is a caveat. If you play one of these as an outlaw and your opponent plays something like a skirmish and wins the combat and defeats your fighter, you won't get the after combat effect off because it requires after combat adjacency, and if your outlaw is defeated, it is removed from the board, which is clearly not adjacent to the opposing fighter. That means that this pair of cards is better to use as Robin Hood than Outlaws, since he usually, hopefully, won't be removed from the board after combat, which is the second reason these are good on defense, timing. Defensive after combat effects will take place before your opponent's offensive ones. So if your opponent plays an attack card with a movement effect on it, your effect will trigger first before they can move away from you. Briefly looping back to Defenders of Sherwood, that's a good block card to play as an outlaw, as it doesn't matter if they get defeated or not after combat. You'll still draw a card and be able to revive an outlaw, maybe even the one that was just defeated in that combat. Specifically looking at Snark, it draws a card, which is something just about every card in this deck does, which is good, as it keeps your hand not empty, but it's certainly a redundant effect at this point. Wily fighting, on the other hand, is much more interesting, as it is the only source of area of effect damage, or AoE, that this hero has, which will be very useful in certain situations where your opponent puts 2 or more of their fighters right next to each other, or you. I would consider using this card offensively given the correct positioning, as it is very similar to Bigfoot's Savagery in that sense. If you do use this offensively, you'll probably be using it as an outlaw though, as Robin Hood is ranged, and even though he can use the special ability after combat, you probably don't want to put him that close to multiple enemy fighters when an outlaw could do the same. And one last important thing to note here. You have no cards in your deck that are capable of blocking with values above 3. This means your opponent will have guaranteed damage if they play a 4 value attack, and that's a guaranteed kill on any of your outlaws. And if they have certain effects on their attacks requiring them to win combats on 4 value attacks like Skirmish, they'll always win the combat against you, and those effects will always trigger, which if your opponent understands this, they can abuse this and give themselves a huge advantage. In certain scenarios, if you think your opponent is playing a high value attack against an outlaw, it might be better just to not block, as even if you play a 3 value block card and they played a higher value one, it wouldn't matter what your card does. You just die anyway, and it's kind of a waste of a block card that you might just rather save for Robin Hood later in the game. Overall, I think Snark is just okay. It draws a card. It doesn't do anything special for this deck. And Wily Fighting is decent, but neither of these cards are particularly good, I'd say. Regardless, you will have to rely on them to block, so you've got to make do with what you've got, and you've got to learn to love these, regardless of how good they are. And lastly, let's talk about the basic cards in Robin Hood's deck. You have 3 feints and 3 regroups. You should use feint as Robin Hood, because if you use it as an outlaw, they're probably going to die anyways, and your opponent will probably save their good effects for attacking Robin Hood, and you want to cancel out those if you can. Regroup is an interesting card in this deck. Well, first let me get this out of the way. You should not use Regroup to block as Robin Hood, unless you have to, but if you have to, yikes, that just sucks. You have a ton of card draw in this deck. You should be able to draw a decent block card as Robin Hood. The designers gave you so much card draw. Use it! Anyways, you could use regroups to block as outlaws, because from most enemy attacks, they're probably going to die anyways, and you may as well just replace regroup with another card that you draw after combat. You could also use regroup to attack as outlaws, because there's a chance your opponent won't block if they think you're playing Highway Robbery, and you get in a free point of damage and you draw 2 cards. So it's like Piercing Shot, but worse. And now with all of the cards out of the way, I think it's finally final thoughts time. Compared to his set counterpart Bigfoot, I think Robin Hood is an extremely interesting hero. His ability, low health, range, and sidekicks lead to a different playstyle than almost every other hero released at this point. And that's avoiding enemy attacks and damage rather than just blocking all of it. His team composition is more interesting than the stock standard melee hero single melee sidekick, which they very well could have done by replacing the Outlaws with Little John or something like that. And I'm glad that they didn't, because multi-sidekick heroes are very fun to play with, and right now there's only 4 of them. His low amount of unique cards and high amount of card draw make him very consistent, and consistency is a big frustration I have with some fighters like Arthur and Alice, who are very fun to play as, but so wildly inconsistent it's downright maddening at some points. He has annoying cards like Ambush and Highway Robbery, and to a certain extent cards like Hunter's Eye, Wily Fighting, and Steal from the Rich could be considered annoying, but these cards individually are each fine. The interesting thing Robin Hood does is just overwhelm you with the sheer volume of annoying cards that he can throw at you, because his card draw lets him constantly dig through his deck and find the next annoyance to fire at you. And while this might make him weaker competitively, I much rather prefer playing as and against this style of strength, a high volume of pesky cards, as opposed to heroes like Medusa and Bigfoot that have a few really oppressive cards. Highway Robbery in particular, I think, is a really fun card because it highlights the combat mind games aspect of this game, which I think is the most fun part. So in conclusion, Robin Hood is a unique hero with an interesting playstyle and balanced cards, and the only thing he has stolen from me is my heart. Thank you so much for watching. Look forward to the set summary for Robin Hood vs. Bigfoot later this week, and after that I'll be starting on the Cobble and Fog characters. You'll never see the first hero guide for that set coming. As always, like, subscribe, and yeet!